It was just after 3:15 a.m. when the first shot cracked through the quiet street of Ocean Avenue, shattering the stillness of the early morning. The sound echoed across the dark water of the bay, a single pulse of violence in the thick, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around the house. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder, the kind of bitter scent that clings to everything and never quite lets go. Ronald DeFeo Jr. stood in the center of the house, his breath ragged, his hands shaking, as he took in the aftermath of what he'd done. His family, his father, his mother, his siblings, lay sprawled across the floor, their bodies lifeless in their beds. Blood had stained the pale carpet, pooling in dark red rivers that twisted toward the walls, and the house, once so alive with the mundane sounds of family life, now held only the eerie, eternal silence of death. The gun had slipped from his grasp, but the deed was done. There were no screams, no last words. They had been taken in their sleep, too quick, too final to resist. The house, old and sprawling, seemed to breathe with a pulse of its own. As the sun began to rise over Amityville, casting long, distorted shadows across the broken windows of a 112 Ocean Avenue, the silence lingered like a dark presence wrapped around the bones of the house. The police arrived within hours, drawn by the strange, unblinking calm of the situation. Nothing about this felt real. Nothing about the way the house stood empty in the early light. Nothing about the way the blood seemed to seep deeper into the floorboards. As the bodies were removed, the house itself seemed to sigh, deep, slow, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting. For what, no one could say. But something about it felt different. Something that would not leave. The DeFeo family's murders made the news, yes. It became a headline, a tragedy. A gruesome, unfathomable tragedy. But those who lived nearby knew that something else was rising from the ashes of that bloodshed. It wasn't just the memory of death that would haunt Ocean Avenue. It was the house itself. A year later, the Lutz family drove up the long, winding driveway of 112 Ocean Avenue, unaware that they were stepping into a nightmare that had yet to reveal its full shape. George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, had come seeking a fresh start. They had no idea that the house they had chosen, for its beauty and space, was already marked by darkness. They'd heard the rumors, of course, the stories that had swirled through Amityville, about the DeFeo murders, about the strange occurrences in the home afterward. But to them, it was just that, stories. After all, how could they know that the house they were moving into was something far beyond the ordinary? How could they have known that the house already had a hunger, an unspoken need that would begin to gnaw at their very souls? From the moment the Lutzes crossed the threshold, something shifted. Kathy had always been sensitive to the energy of places. She could feel it, the way others might sense a shift in temperature. But this was something else entirely. There was a coldness to the air that seemed to press in on her, the kind of cold that doesn't come from winter, but from something deeper, something older. George felt it too, though he wouldn't admit it at first. He'd chalked it up to stress. Moving into a new home was always a challenge. But there was something about the house, something wrong. In the evenings, the house seemed to groan and shift, the old wood creaking as though trying to speak. It was subtle at first, just the settling of an old building, they told themselves. But then came the smells. At first it was faint, a pungent odor of rot that clung to the walls and refused to leave, no matter how many candles they lit, how many windows they opened. Then the cold spots began. Kathy, on one quiet morning, had felt an icy draft move across her legs, as if something had brushed by her in the dark. She'd looked around, expecting to see one of the children, or even George, but there was nothing. No one. It was only when the black ooze appeared, thick, sticky and dripping from the walls, that they knew the house had woken. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of the mind. There was something in the house, something real, something that had always been there, waiting. And then there was the red room. Kathy had found it in the basement, a small, unremarkable door at the far corner. She had opened it once, and for a moment, all she had seen was darkness. But in that darkness, something had stirred. A voice, soft and low, whispered her name, just once. When she tried to go back later, the door was locked and no one had a key. The house was speaking to them in ways they couldn't yet understand. By the end of their first week, the Lutz family began to feel the weight of something unseen pressing against them. The children had nightmares. The walls seemed to groan at night, as though something was trying to push its way out. George found himself waking up at odd hours, staring out the window, his mind clouded, his thoughts jagged like broken glass. The worst part, though, was the feeling that something was always watching. There were eyes in the dark, eyes that weren't human. It was as if the house itself had become a living thing, aware of them, knowing their every move. And the thing was, no one talked about it, not openly. It was the quiet things, the small things, the way the air would shift. How, some nights, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, would echo through the empty halls, and no one was there. No one spoke of the voices either, the ones that whispered in the corners of the house, faint as the wind but growing stronger by the day. Some nights, Kathy would sit up in bed, frozen with fear, listening to those whispers. They were too quiet to understand, but they were always there, always just out of reach, brushing against her mind like the tendrils of a dream. But there was something else too. A presence, a shape, a figure, pale and strange, standing just at the edge of the children's rooms. Its eyes, cold, dark, pig-like, watched them as they slept. And in the mornings, when they woke, the house seemed somehow darker. It was only later, when they found out about Jody, the thing in the house, the shape that had been there before them, that they began to understand the true depth of the horror. Jody was never fully seen, but in the moments when the house was silent, when the wind outside howled through the trees, Jody would make itself known. The figure with the strange glowing eyes would appear, always just beyond the edges of their vision. And there was the smell again, the smell of decay, of something dead, but not quite dead enough. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was something much older. They had only been there for 2 weeks when things began to escalate. The noises grew louder, more frantic. The presence grew stronger. George became distant, his anger shifting, building like a storm inside of him. He found himself drawn, inexplicably, to the basement. He didn't know why. He only knew that something was calling to him from there. He felt the pull of it, like a tide too strong to resist. And it wasn't just him. Kathy too began to change. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollow, and at night she would hear whispers, those voices, growing louder and more insistent. The house, it seemed, was alive, and it was growing hungrier. George Lutz's obsession with the basement grew stronger as the days passed. At first, it was a passing curiosity, a strange tug in the back of his mind, one he could easily ignore. But the more he tried to resist, the more he felt it. Something down there, something in the dark, calling to him with a voice only he could hear. His family noticed it too. Kathy, with her sensitive nature, could see it in his eyes, that distant look. The man she had married was slipping away from her, slowly being consumed by something he couldn't even name. But it wasn't just George. There were things happening around the house, things too strange to explain away. The children had begun to retreat into themselves, withdrawing from each other. The eldest, Danny, had stopped talking about what he saw at night. Instead, he just stared at the walls, his eyes wide, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. He clutched his stuffed animal to his chest, the only comfort in a house that seemed bent on twisting everything good into something sinister. And then there was the smell. It began again with that rotting, foul odour, something close to death but not quite dead enough. It was like the stench of something buried beneath the house, festering. At first, Kathy assumed it was just mould, something that came with the age of the place. But as the days passed, the smell grew stronger, richer, more nauseating. One afternoon, Kathy decided to investigate. She opened the door to the basement, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The temperature dropped at once, a biting cold that seeped through her skin and into her bones. The air felt thick, pressing against her, as though it were alive. She stepped down the creaking stairs, but as her foot hit the bottom step, she felt the oppressive weight of the space push back at her. The basement was no longer just a cellar. It felt like an abyss, endless, dark, consuming. Something was down there. The thought made her freeze. She stood at the foot of the stairs, her breath catching in her throat as the smell of decay thickened. She could feel something watching her from the shadows, something unseen but undeniably present. The door to the small utility room in the far corner of the basement stood ajar, and it was from there that the stench seemed to emanate. But it was more than just the smell. It was the sound, the faint rustling, like something large shifting in the dark. Without thinking, Kathy turned and fled upstairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She bolted the door to the basement behind her, hoping to lock whatever lay down there away from the rest of the house. But she knew. She knew that the house had already begun to claim them. Night after night, the Lutz family's sleep became more fragmented. The house seemed to breathe around them, slow and deliberate, filling the spaces between their thoughts with something wrong. George began to wake at odd hours, always around 3:15 a.m., the same time that Ronald DeFeo had committed his murders the year before. At first, it was only the wakeful, unsettled feeling of knowing something was wrong, but soon it grew into an obsession. He would wake up gasping for air, his mind clouded, and would find himself staring into the darkness, unable to move. One night, George heard it. The voices. It wasn't the whispers from the walls, like the ones Kathy had heard. No, this was different, clearer, more insistent. It sounded like a soft murmur at first, and then a louder, more urgent call, coming from the direction of the basement. "George!" The voice sounded like Kathy's, but it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. It wasn't her. It was something else. His breath quickened, his heart racing in his chest. He felt that same cold weight pressing against him, pulling him down into the dark. He had to go to the basement. He didn't know why. He just knew he had to go. The pull of it was too strong. But when he reached the stairs, he froze. There was something at the top of the stairs, a shadow, dark and shapeless, waiting just beyond the light. For a split second, George thought he saw something move, something large and dark, with eyes glowing like embers in the deep black. The shadow seemed to reach for him, its form flickering in and out of the dim light, like smoke in the air. He recoiled, stumbling backward, the words of the voice still echoing in his head. "Come to me, George. Come." The feeling in the house had shifted, deepened. What had been strange whispers before was now something urgent, something calling to them all. The house was no longer a place. They were trapped inside it, and the walls were closing in. The children were the first to notice the change in their father. Danny, particularly, seemed sensitive to George's moods, and as his father grew more agitated, the boy became more withdrawn. He spent his days in his room, playing quietly with his toys, but his eyes never left the corners of the room. At night, when the house groaned and shifted, he would whisper to his stuffed animal, as though asking it for protection. Kathy noticed it too. George had become short-tempered, unpredictable. He would snap at her over trivial things, his voice rising in anger, though he'd always apologize afterward. But the apologies never lasted. The next night, it would happen again. He would wake up with a new obsession, a new need to go to the basement to get closer, and when he couldn't, when the house wouldn't allow him, it would anger him. One night, as she lay in bed beside him, Kathy heard him murmur in his sleep. His words were slow, heavy, like he was dragging them out of the darkness of his own mind. "There's something down there. I have to go. I have to—" The last words were nothing but a whisper, but they sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to wake him, but his grip on her arm tightened like a vice, and she could feel the heat radiating off of him, feverish, burning. The next morning, George was distant, quieter than usual. He didn't speak of the basement, didn't speak of the voices, but the tension in the house was palpable. It clung to everything, every room, every surface. Kathy began to wonder if they had made a mistake, if the house they had moved into was far more than they had bargained for. It was a few nights later when the cross in the upstairs bedroom began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in its position on the wall, something almost imperceptible. But as the hours passed, the movement became more pronounced. The crucifix, once hanging perfectly straight, began to twist, just a little at first, then more, until the figure of Christ was upside down. It was then that Kathy realized, whatever was in the house, whatever was stirring beneath its old floorboards, had begun to take its toll on all of them. There was no denying it anymore. There was something in the house, something far more ancient than any of them could understand. And it wasn't letting them go. The cold of the basement was unlike anything the Lutz family had experienced. George felt it pulling at him, deeper than any chill he'd ever known, and the more he tried to resist, the stronger it became. The basement had turned from a mere storage space into something far more sinister. It was a place where time seemed to stretch and contract, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At night, when the air outside thickened with fog, the house would grow still. A deep, uneasy silence would blanket the rooms, broken only by the occasional groan of wood against itself, like the house was shifting in its sleep. George began to slip into these moments of silence, drawn to them. He spent more time in the basement now, staring into the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, unable to tear his eyes away from the black hole of the space. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. There was a hunger in the air, and George felt it coiling around him, tightening its grip. His body was no longer his own. The house was inside him, inside his thoughts, pulling him down into that dark, cold place below. Kathy could see it. She could see how George's eyes would glaze over, how his movements became slower, more deliberate, as if he was losing touch with the world outside. The man she had once loved, the man she had married, was being consumed by something in the house, something he couldn't escape. She had no one to turn to, no one who would believe her, no one would understand. The stories about 112 Ocean Avenue, about the Defio murders, were just stories to most people, but she had lived it now, felt the house breathe, heard it whisper her name. She wasn't alone. None of them were. The children, too, had begun to change. Danny's nightmares worsened. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, thrashing in his bed, as if he were being chased by something only he could see. Kathy would rush to his side, her heart pounding, but by the time she reached him, Danny would fall silent, his eyes wide and unfocused. His gaze would always be turned toward the far corner of the room, toward the spot where the shadows seemed to move just a little too much. At first, Kathy had thought it was the stress of moving to a new house, a new town. But now it was clear. The house was feeding on their fear, on their unease, and it was shaping their reality. It wasn't just a house. It was a presence. And it was alive. One evening, as George sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window into the thickening fog, he heard it. It was faint at first, just a whisper, so soft he thought it might have been the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, closer. "George!" His breath caught in his throat, and he turned toward the sound. But there was no one there, only the empty space between the door and the shadows beyond. Still, the voice lingered, like smoke in the room. "Come to me." He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. His feet moved of their own accord. guided by a force he couldn't control. He stumbled into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The house seemed to pulse around him. Each step he took closer to the basement. Down the stairs he went, drawn to the darkness below. When he reached the basement, the temperature plummeted. He could feel his breath fogging in the air, the cold sinking deep into his bones. But it wasn't just the cold. It was something more. It was as though the house itself was freezing him in place, trapping him in its grip. He stood there, in the dim light, staring into the abyss of the basement. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. He felt like he was being suffocated, his chest tightening with each passing second. And then he heard it again. Closer this time. A voice, deeper than before and far more insistent. "George, you are mine." He couldn't move. His body felt as though it was no longer his own. His hands trembled, his skin cold and clammy. He was there. He was in the basement, surrounded by the oppressive darkness. And then, something more, something that wasn't human. It brushed past him, a cold draft that sent shivers down his spine. He spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows, flickering at the edges of the room. Meanwhile, Kathy was upstairs, pacing. She had felt the change in George. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by the house. She had tried to reach him, tried to pull him out of the trance-like state that had overtaken him. But it was as though he was slipping further and further away, drawn deeper into something she couldn't understand. She had never believed in the supernatural, not like this. But now she couldn't deny it. There was something in that house, something old and hungry, something that wanted them, needed them. She went to the children's room that night. She found Danny sitting up in bed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at her, but it wasn't as if he saw her. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's watching me." She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. He had been having the same nightmares, the ones that kept him awake at night, eyes darting around the room as though searching for something he couldn't name. "What do you mean, Danny?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice calm, though her heart was hammering in her chest. "The thing," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's in the room. It's in the corner. It's waiting." Kathy's eyes darted toward the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just the soft moonlight that filtered through the curtains, casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. "Danny, you're just tired. It's just a bad dream." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, that something was lurking, just out of sight, waiting for them all to fall asleep so it could feed. Later that night, after the children had fallen into an uneasy slumber, Kathy heard it, the same low murmur, the same voice that had been calling to George, now calling to her. "Kathy!" She froze in bed, her eyes wide. It was softer than the others, but there was no mistaking it. "Kathy!" The voice was coming from the basement. It was unmistakable now. It wasn't the house groaning. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice that seemed to slither into her ears, wrapping itself around her mind, pulling her toward the stairs, toward the darkness. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from below. She didn't want to go. She couldn't, but she had to. There was something in the house that wouldn't let her rest, something that wanted them all. With shaking hands, Kathy pulled herself from the bed and walked toward the door. The house seemed to exhale as she passed, the cold air of the basement creeping up the stairs like a thick, invisible fog. She reached the doorway, and then the coldest voice of all, thick with malice, whispered in her ear. "Come, join us." The stairs creaked under Kathy's feet as she moved down toward the basement. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, each beat louder than the last, each thump an insistent warning to turn back. But the house was pulling at her, the air thick with the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. She couldn't fight it. Not anymore. She reached the bottom of the stairs and felt a rush of cold so intense it burned her skin. The basement stretched out before her, a yawning dark maw that seemed to grow larger with every step she took. The familiar smell of rot, of decay, was stronger here. It wasn't just the must of an old house. It wasn't just mildew. It was something far worse, something alive. She could almost taste the air, thick with its sourness. The whispers were louder now, soft, sweet, and insidious. They wrapped around her like fingers brushing against her skin. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, a low hum, all calling her name, all beckoning her deeper into the shadows. Kathy, come. The voice was deep, guttural, and somehow familiar. She couldn't place it, but she felt it claw at her mind, like a vine wrapping itself around her thoughts, tightening with every second. Her hands trembled as she gripped the railing, but her body kept moving. She didn't want to, but she was moving anyway, drawn to the far corner of the basement where the utility room stood. The place she'd felt that presence before, the place where something stirred in the dark. Something had been waiting for her. She reached the door to the utility room and stopped, her breath shallow in her chest. The air here was heavier, almost thick enough to swallow her whole. She reached for the door, and just as her fingers touched the knob, a cold gust of wind rushed past her, as though the house had exhaled, releasing a pressure that had built inside for decades. Her body stiffened. It felt like the house was alive, breathing. "Mom." She spun around to see Danny standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide and filled with terror. His small frame was trembling in the doorway, his bare feet standing on the cold floor. "Mum, don't go in there," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, it's not safe." Kathy's heart twisted with a pang of fear, but the house, whatever it was, tugged at her again, harder now, pulling her toward the door, toward the unknown. "Danny?" she said softly, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She reached out to him, but her hand trembled, her fingers just barely brushing his arm before she jerked away. She couldn't stop herself. The force pulling her toward the room was too strong. With a shaky breath, Kathy opened the door. And that was when she saw it. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. Its bare walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with old forgotten things, boxes of tools, jars of chemicals, broken appliances. But what drew her attention was not the debris, nor the shelves that groaned under the weight of years of neglect. It was the wall, the far wall, the one closest to her, where the red liquid oozed down, thick and dark like blood. It wasn't the typical stains of a leaky pipe, or the rot of an old house. It was something far more sinister. The liquid ran down the cracked surface in slow, deliberate drips, as though it was alive, as though it was reaching for her, begging her to come closer. Kathy couldn't look away. She stepped forward, her feet moving almost against her will, as though the house was guiding her. The air grew colder still, and she felt the pulse of the house, a deep vibration humming in the pit of her stomach. She reached out a hand, fingers trembling, drawn to the dark ooze. And then there was a voice. But not the voices she'd heard before. This one was different. It was thick, full of malice, as if it came from the very bones of the house. "You belong to me now." The voice echoed in her mind, slithering beneath her skin. Her fingers brushed the wall, and the coldness stung her hand like frostbite. But it wasn't just cold. It was alive. Something was moving in the wall. Something that was watching her, waiting for her to fall into its grasp. Suddenly, her head spun, and she staggered back, her heart racing. The room began to warp, the walls bending inward, as though the very space around her was collapsing. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, choking silence of the basement. "Mom!" Danny's voice cut through the haze, pulling her back to reality. She blinked, her vision swimming, and then she saw him, standing in the doorway, eyes wide with terror. "Mom, please, it's not you." Kathy's breath came in ragged gasps. Her head felt dizzy, as though the world itself was turning upside down. She took a step backward, away from the wall, but her feet felt heavy, as though the floor was pulling her in. The shadows around her shifted, and the whispers returned, louder now, 1,000 voices filling the space, surrounding her. They were laughing, low, throaty, unnatural laughter that raked across her mind like claws. "George!" Her heart stopped. The name slipped out before she could stop it, as though the house had forced it from her. She turned toward the stairs, but the shadows had already started moving toward her, curling around her legs like vines. "George!" The voice was everywhere now. It was the house speaking to her. The house that had taken hold of her mind, her very soul. It was pulling her in. "George, help me." But there was no answer. No answer, except for the dark, unblinking silence that stretched behind her. Back upstairs, George lay in bed, his body stiff, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the house groaning, the walls whispering, the floorboards creaking as if something was crawling beneath them, something that wanted to escape. But it wasn't just the house anymore. It was him. He could feel the pull again, that familiar tug, like something was calling him, something deep in the house, the basement. He couldn't stop himself. Kathy stumbled back into the hallway, her legs shaking, her mind clouded. She could feel the cold air crawling up her spine, feel the house alive, like it was feeding off her terror. She tried to call out for George, but her voice was drowned in the roar of the house, a scream that turned inward. "Mom!" Danny screamed again. "Mom! Don't leave us!" She turned toward him, but as she did, the world seemed to bend, to twist. "Mom!" And in that moment, she realized it wasn't Danny's voice she was hearing. It was something else, something darker, something that had been waiting, something that was no longer content to remain hidden. The walls of 112 Ocean Avenue seemed to breathe. It wasn't just the creaking of the old house settling or the hum of the wind seeping through cracks in the wood. No, it was something deeper, something ancient, something that had been there long before the Defios had moved in, before the Lutz family had arrived seeking peace. The house itself was alive, and now it was awake. Kathy could feel it in the air, the suffocating, oppressive presence pressing down on her. It was no longer the whispers of voices, distant and fleeting, no longer the strange murmurs coming from behind closed doors. Now it was more direct. It was the house itself, speaking to her through her very thoughts, manipulating her mind, her senses, blurring the line between what was real and what was not. "Mum, you're not you." Danny's words echoed in her mind, and she turned, her eyes darting to the hallway where her son stood, his small body trembling with fear. But it wasn't just fear she saw in his eyes. It was recognition. Recognition that she wasn't the woman he had known. She wasn't Kathy anymore. Her mind was slipping, dissolving under the weight of something far darker. The house had taken root inside of her, and she could feel the tendrils wrapping tighter with each passing second. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. "Danny," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the very air around her was choking the sound. He took a step back, his eyes wide with horror. "Mom, don't." But it wasn't her son who spoke, was it? It was something else, something trapped beneath the surface of her thoughts, something pulling at her from within. She could feel it. She could hear it now, louder, more insistent. "Go to him, Kathy. He belongs to me now." It was the same voice she'd heard before, the one that called her down to the basement. The one that had pulled her into the depths of the house. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't human. It was the house itself, speaking to her, controlling her. It wasn't just using her, it was becoming her. She tried to move toward Danny, but her legs felt heavy, her body no longer obeying her will. The shadows seemed to crawl up the walls, thick and suffocating, creeping along the floor like smoke. It was closing in on her, and no matter how hard she tried to resist, she felt herself being pulled into it. "No, no," she gasped, her breath shallow as she took a step back. She felt dizzy, her vision blurring. "Danny, And then she heard it, a low, guttural laugh, deep from within the walls of the house. The sound was wet, as though something was slithering beneath the floorboards, a sound so chilling it made her blood run cold. "Mum." Danny's voice was softer now, more desperate. "Please, come with me." But it wasn't him anymore. It wasn't Danny standing there, looking at her with his wide, terrified eyes. It was the house. It was the presence, shaping his voice, molding his face, trying to pull her further into the dark. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. The pressure in the house was unbearable now. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with their weight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something that had died and rotted long ago. Her hand reached for the railing of the stairs, but the wood felt cold, slick, as though it was alive, twitching under her touch. And then she saw it, the black ooze. It was running down the stairs now, dripping slowly, steadily, like a living thing. It pooled at the bottom, a thick, viscous liquid that gleamed in the dim light of the hallway. The same ooze that had tainted the basement, that had dripped from the walls. She felt herself stumbling forward, unable to stop. The darkness called to her, pulling her closer to the stain. Her feet moved of their own accord, and her body, numb and distant, followed. But then Danny screamed, "Mum, don't!" It snapped her back to herself. She blinked, the fog lifting just enough for her to see him again. Her son, standing at the top of the stairs, staring at her with wide, pleading eyes. The house was trying to take him too, trying to take them all. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking through the oppressive weight of the air. She reached for him, but her feet slid in the dark, the ooze underfoot slick and unyielding. And then she felt it. A cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was nothing there. No one. Only the darkness, swirling and shifting in the corners of her vision. But the pressure was still there, pushing against her, pulling her in. "George," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Where was he? Upstairs in the master bedroom, George sat still, his back rigid against the wall. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't seeing anything at all. The house had him now, had wrapped itself around his mind like a vice. He could feel it in every bone, every breath. The house was calling him, whispering his name, pulling him down into the depths. "George!" The voice came again. But it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. The house was demanding his presence. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the bed, staring out into the dark hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, twisting, reaching toward him. It was here. It was waiting for him. He stood up, but his legs felt unsteady. He stumbled toward the door as though his body was on autopilot, moving without his consent. The house was leading him, pulling him into the unknown, into the dark. Kathy stumbled through the hall, her feet moving, as if weighed down by invisible chains. She could feel the house breathing, could feel it pulsing in the walls. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, suffocating her, making it harder and harder to breathe. "Danny," she gasped, her voice cracking. But there was no answer, only the silence, the heavy, thick silence that enveloped her. She reached the top of the stairs, staring down at the growing pool of black ooze that seemed to rise up to meet her. The shadows danced around her, tugging at her, whispering things she didn't understand. The door to the basement was open. It had always been open, and in the dark, deep below, she could feel it. Something was waiting. Downstairs in the basement, the air was colder than it had ever been before. The darkness was thick, pressing down on her from all sides, closing in. She could hear the faintest sound, soft at first, like a breath, like a whisper. Then it became clear. A child's laugh. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the sound of her own rapid breathing. But then it came again, louder this time, filling the space around her. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. This was it. This was the thing that had been pulling them, pulling her toward the house, toward the basement. This was the heart of it, the source, the thing that had been waiting for them all along. Kathy's hand trembled as she reached toward the cold metal of the basement door. And then she stepped through. The air in the basement was heavier now, suffocating, pressing against Kathy's chest like 1,000 invisible hands. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was bitter, like the frost of a long-dead winter. She could feel it in her lungs, each breath a battle against the weight of the darkness around her. The floor was slick beneath her feet, as if the house itself was bleeding, and with each step she took, she felt herself sinking deeper into it. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash, and she spun around, her heart lurching in her chest. Her hand reached for the doorknob, but it was cold, too cold. It was as if the door had frozen in place, locked tight by something far stronger than mere wood and metal. And then, there it was. The darkness ahead of her shifted, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. The faintest sound began to rise from the deep shadows, a low hum that seemed to come from the very walls. It wasn't a voice, not in the way she had heard before. It was a presence, a vibration that rattled her bones and twisted her mind. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her in ways she couldn't understand, couldn't escape. And then came the whispers. Not the sweet, soft tones of before, not the voices that had called her name from upstairs or inside the walls. These whispers were sharp, jagged, laced with malice. They crawled beneath her skin, and for the first time she understood. She wasn't just trapped inside the house was inside her. The sound of footsteps came from behind her, slow and deliberate, and she spun around, heart racing, expecting to see George or one of the children. But there was no one. Only the darkness, stretching endlessly into the basement. But there was something else. The smell. That sickening, foul odor of rot and decay had grown stronger, heavier. It wasn't just the dampness of an old house anymore. It was the smell of death, of something long dead, buried beneath the foundation. And then she saw it. A shape, hovering just beyond the reach of the flickering bulb overhead. At first, it was just a blur, a dark figure that loomed larger with every second. But as she stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat, she could see it more clearly. It was Jody. It was the thing that had been watching them all along, the shadow that had moved in the corners of their vision, the presence that had whispered their names in the night. But now, it wasn't hiding anymore. It was standing right in front of her, its form dark and shifting, an impossible shape that twisted in and out of reality. Its eyes. God, its eyes. They were glowing, dark, pig-like eyes that reflected nothing but malice, nothing but hunger, and it wasn't just watching her. No, it was looking at her, staring into her very soul, as if it could see the fear in her heart, the doubt, the terror. It was feeding on her. And then came the voice. "You're mine now." The words slithered into her mind like a snake, coiling around her thoughts, binding her to the house, to the thing in front of her. She tried to turn away, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the house had wrapped its fingers around her, forcing her to stay. Her heart pounded, and her thoughts blurred. She wanted to scream. She needed to scream. But no sound came. The room began to pulse, the walls breathing in and out with a slow, rhythmic beat. It was as though the house was alive, its very bones shifting, creaking, stretching. The air thickened, closing in on her like a vice. The shadows, once lingering at the edges of her vision, were now alive, moving, swirling around her feet, around her legs. The smell of death filled the space, growing stronger, thicker. Jodi's form was no longer just a blur. It had shape and substance, and it was moving toward her. It was no longer just watching her. It was coming for her. She tried to back away, to escape, but her legs were like lead. She stumbled, almost falling, her hands reaching out for something, anything that could anchor her to the real world. But there was nothing. "You can't escape," the voice rasped, low and guttural, coming from all around her now. "We are one. The house is you, and you are the house." The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling her deeper, pulling her into itself. The shadows grew thicker, the air more suffocating. The darkness was no longer just a space. It was a force, a presence, something that wrapped around her mind, around her very soul. And then, without warning, the lights above flickered and went out. The entire basement was consumed by total, suffocating darkness. Upstairs, George was moving through the house with a strange, distant calm. He didn't know how he had gotten out of the bedroom. He didn't know how he had come to stand in the hallway, staring down at the stairs that led to the basement. But he knew one thing. He had to go down there. He had to find her. He didn't understand why. It wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion. A force inside him that made his legs move toward the stairs, his feet pulling him toward the abyss. The presence in the house, the thing that had begun to seep into his thoughts, had become undeniable. It was inside him now, like a sickness. It had wrapped itself around his mind, around his thoughts, and it was dragging him down into the darkness. He reached the top of the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The house groaned beneath him, as though it were a living thing, its breath heavy and slow. He could feel it, pulsing under the floorboards, pulling him deeper. "George." The voice was faint, soft at first, but it grew louder. It was Kathy's voice. He stepped down the stairs, his movements slow, deliberate, as though the house was controlling him, making him move in rhythm with its heartbeat. The air grew colder as he descended, and the stench of decay hit him, like a physical blow. The darkness ahead of him seemed to shift, as though it were alive and waiting for him. "Kathy," he whispered, but the words felt like a lie, as if the house itself was making him speak them. He reached the bottom of the stairs and there she was. Or at least, what was left of her. Her form stood in the middle of the basement, eyes wide and glassy, staring into the dark. Her body was rigid, unmoving, as though frozen in place. The shadow that had been Jodi before was now all around her, wrapping itself around her like an embrace. "Kathy." George's voice faltered, but he could feel himself slipping into the same fog, the same grip that had taken her. The house was pulling at him, trying to consume him just as it had her. And then, a low voice from the shadows, her voice, whispered, "You're home now, George." And the darkness closed in. George's mind was slipping, just as Kathy's had. The house had a way of drowning thought, of overwhelming the senses until all that was left was the cold, suffocating presence of it. The walls were closing in around him, stretching and warping, twisting until the space around him felt like it was expanding and contracting with each breath he took. The shadows, thick and suffocating, slithered across the floor like liquid, dark tendrils that brushed against his skin. He reached for Kathy, but his hand went through her. There was no warmth, no pulse beneath her cold, lifeless body. She stood there, still and empty, eyes unblinking, a shell of the woman he had once known. The air felt hollow around her, as though her very presence had been drained, replaced with the hollow echo of something far darker. "Kathy," he whispered again. But this time, the words sounded like a plea, an echo swallowed by the abyss that surrounded him. The house trembled beneath his feet, and the shadows seemed to pull in closer, wrapping around his legs, his arms, dragging him toward the center of the basement. He couldn't move. His body was no longer his own. It was as if the house had taken hold of him entirely, weaving itself into his very being, suffocating him in the dark. He looked back at Kathy, but her face had changed. The pale, lifeless expression she had worn moments before had twisted into something else, something darker. Her eyes had become hollow pits, two black, empty voids that reflected nothing but the house itself. "George." Her voice came from her mouth, but it was no longer hers. It was the house. It was Jody. It was everything that had ever been buried in this cursed place. The house had devoured her. Upstairs, Danny sat on the floor of his room, his back pressed against the corner. His small hands were clutched tightly around his stuffed animal, his only comfort in the oppressive silence that had taken over the house. The darkness outside the window had thickened, the night creeping in like a shadow that swallowed everything in its path. He hadn't seen his parents for hours, and the fear that had been gnawing at his mind all day had reached its peak. He could feel it in the air. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The house had started to hum, a low vibration that seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards, in the walls. It was alive. It had always been alive. And now it was feeding on them. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the sounds of the house, the whispers, the low hum, the faint scraping of something moving in the walls. But it was impossible to escape. He heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer, the sound of someone or something walking down the hall, closer to his door. His breath caught in his throat as the door creaked open. "Mum," he whispered, his voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing. And then the figure stepped into the room. It wasn't Kathy. It wasn't even human. The figure that stood in the doorway was something monstrous, a shifting shape of darkness, its form twisted and warped, glowing eyes burning through the shadows. It was Jody. It had been watching them all along. It had been feeding on their fear, their weakness, growing stronger with every passing day. Danny wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen in place, his limbs stiff, his mouth dry. The figure moved closer, its presence growing heavier, its dark, pig-like eyes fixed on him, crawling deeper into his soul. It whispered his name, a low growl that rattled his bones. "Danny." He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, constricted. The figure reached for him, its cold, wet hand brushing against his cheek. "No," he whispered. "Please." But it was too late. The house had already won. Downstairs, George stood in the center of the basement, frozen, his eyes fixed on Kathy's body. The darkness had fully swallowed him now. His thoughts were hazy, slipping away like water through his fingers. The house had taken everything from him, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a man who had once been alive, once been human. He could feel it. Jody, the thing in the shadows, rising up around him, seeping into his skin, his bones. It wasn't just the house anymore. It had become part of him. It had made him its own. The air was thick with the sound of his heartbeat, each pulse a painful reminder that he was still here, still alive. But he wasn't the man he had been. Not anymore. The house had changed him. The house had consumed him. A voice whispered from the darkness. It wasn't Kathy's. It wasn't even his own. "You belong to me now, George." The voice was low, deep, insistent. It slithered into his thoughts, wrapping around them, controlling them. until he could no longer distinguish where the house ended and where he began. The walls seemed to close in, the space shrinking, pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. His fingers twitched, his muscles locked. The basement was alive, alive with the presence of the house. It was as if the very foundation of the place had become a part of him, pulling him deeper into the dark, suffocating him. He tried to fight it. He tried to scream, but the house swallowed his voice, choked it in its endless depths. And then he saw it, a figure, a shadow, the shape of something that had been there long before the DeFeos, long before the Lutz family, had ever stepped foot into 112 Ocean Avenue. It was the thing that had always lived here, the thing that had watched from the corners of their rooms, from the darkness of the basement. It was Jody. But now it was something more, something older, something darker. Its glowing eyes burned through the shadows, and it stepped forward, the very ground beneath it trembling with each movement. It was hungry, hungry for their fear, hungry for their souls. "Join us!" the voice whispered again, louder this time, filling every corner of the house, echoing in George's mind. "Join us in the darkness!" And George felt it, felt himself being pulled deeper into the house, deeper into the dark. His body was no longer his own. He had become one with the house. And now there was no escaping. The last thought he had before everything was consumed was this: the house had claimed them all. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The house, once full of life and light, now stood cold and empty, its halls echoing only with the sound of its own breath. The presence within had faded for now, but the air was still thick with its weight, heavy with the memory of what had been. 112. Ocean Avenue had consumed the Lutz family, just as it had done to the DeFeos before them. It had taken everything, every shred of humanity, every ounce of light, and twisted it into darkness. But some things never truly leave. Some houses don't want to be forgotten. Years had passed since the Lutz family fled the house, but 112 Ocean Avenue still loomed, unchanging, on its quiet street in Amityville. The house, with its dilapidated exterior and broken windows, was as much a part of the town's history as the stories of the DeFeo murders, of the strange, unexplainable events that followed. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like nothing more than a haunted relic, abandoned and forgotten. But there were those who knew better. They knew that the house wasn't just empty. It was waiting. And like all things that wait, it grew hungrier with time. After the Lutz family's departure, the house had stood silent for a while. It had waited, like an animal holding its breath before pouncing. The memories of what had happened within its walls, the deaths, the torment, the madness, hung in the air like a thick fog, a presence that could never be fully erased. But even after the Lutzes were gone, something remained. Something had changed when they left. The house had tasted their fear, their pain, and it had become stronger. No one had dared to return for years, but the whispers persisted, rumors growing louder. People still spoke of the house, how it was cursed, how it wasn't just the spirits of the DeFeo family that haunted it, but something far older. Something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to wake. One such night, in the dead of winter, a group of paranormal investigators, curious, defiant, decided to explore 112 Ocean Avenue. They had heard the stories, yes, but they weren't afraid. They thought it was just a house, just a place where things had happened. What could possibly be left? What could possibly remain of the terror that had gripped the Lutz family and those before them? They had no idea what they were walking into. The house creaked as they entered, the old door protesting against their touch. The air was thick and damp, the smell of rot mingling with the bitter cold that had begun to seep in through the cracks. The darkness inside seemed to move, curling around them, like a living thing, closing in on them from all sides. It had been years since anyone had dared step inside, and yet it felt as though the house had been waiting for them, waiting for someone to open its doors again. "Are you sure about this?" one of the investigators asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His flashlight flickered weakly as he pointed it toward the shadows ahead. The others, seemingly braver, nodded and stepped forward. They had equipment: cameras, EVP recorders, thermal sensors, but even that didn't seem to settle the cold, gnawing sense of unease that filled the air. The house, as if responding to their presence, seemed to sigh. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, but it wasn't the sound of an old house settling. It was something else, something alive. They moved slowly, cautiously, through the darkened rooms. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the weight of something unseen, but undeniably there. The walls seemed to pulse, as though breathing with them. The shadows shifted in the corners of their eyes, and every so often there was the faintest sound, like a whisper, but too soft to catch. They made their way down the hallway toward the basement door. It was where it all began, they knew. The basement, the heart of the house, the place where the darkness had been born. And just as they reached for the door, it opened on its own, the sound of the hinges groaning loudly through the silence. None of them had touched it. They stood frozen, the air thickening around them, as the door swung wide open. Beyond it, the basement lay in shadows, dark and impenetrable. The temperature dropped sharply, a biting chill that seemed to cut straight through their clothes and into their bones. One by one, they descended into the basement, stepping into the heart of the house, into the very belly of the beast. The basement was colder than they had imagined, colder than anything they'd prepared for. The walls were damp with moisture, and the floor was slick, covered in a film of something black, something that resembled tar, but more viscous, more alive. And then they saw it. At the far end of the basement, where the old utility room once stood, there was a faint light. Not natural, not from a bulb or a window, but a strange, otherworldly glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The investigators froze, their eyes locked on the light, their bodies stiff with fear. "Is that?" one of them whispered, his voice trailing off as he took a cautious step forward. But the air had shifted. The temperature had dropped even further, until their breath came out in thick clouds of white. The light at the far end flickered violently, and then, all at once, the shadows surged toward them. They moved too fast, like a tidal wave, crawling along the floor, up the walls, toward them. "Get out!" one of them screamed, but it was too late. The shadows were upon them. They rushed over them, swirling, suffocating, and then silence. The house seemed to breathe once more. Upstairs, the only sound was the creak of the old wood. The house, alive as it had been so many years ago, waited. It waited for those who were foolish enough to believe they could conquer it, to those who thought they could enter its domain and leave unscathed. But the house had tasted the fear of the Lutz family, had fed on their terror, and it had grown strong. It had absorbed them, devoured them, and now it was feeding again. The investigators never left the house. Some houses, like the one at 112 Ocean Avenue, are not just buildings. They are living things, ancient and hungry. They feed on fear, on pain, on the souls of those who are trapped inside. And while the physical remnants of the Lutz family, the DeFeos and others may have faded, the house still breathes. It still watches. And it will never let go. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had become a myth, a whispered legend among the locals of Amityville. No one really lived there anymore. Not since the Lutz family had fled in terror, and certainly not since the DeFeo murders had occurred over a decade earlier. The house had passed through multiple hands over the years, but none of them lasted. Each person, each family that dared to move in, was consumed by the same thing. The same suffocating, unshakable darkness that had twisted the lives of all who had come before them. It wasn't just the walls, the floors, or the ceilings that held the darkness. It was something more ancient, something that could not be understood or fought, something that waited, patiently, for those who would inevitably be drawn in. But some knew better than to enter. The house, despite its age, stood like a watchful sentinel, its crooked form casting a long shadow over the street. It was the kind of place that haunted the town without trying. It didn't need to. Its history was enough. No one walked past it without feeling a chill, without the sudden urge to glance over their shoulder, to make sure they weren't being watched by something unseen. Yet, for all its whispers and legends, there was one thing that the house could not escape: curiosity. And so, over the years, other people came. The curious, the brave, the ones who thought they understood the stories, the ones who thought they could break the curse, uncover the truth, and leave unscathed. But none of them did. Each of them met the same fate, each disappearing without a trace. The house, once again, consumed. It was one winter's evening when the newest attempt to unmask the house began. This time, it wasn't a group of investigators, but a documentary team. They had heard the stories, watched the films, read the books. They came to tell the story. The story that had haunted the headlines for so many years. The crew arrived with cameras and equipment, with all the bravado of those who believed themselves immune to the terror that had taken hold of 112 Ocean Avenue. Their goal was simple: find out if the haunting was real, or if it was all an elaborate hoax. They weren't interested in ghosts or demons. They wanted to find the truth, whatever that truth might be. And so they began their journey inside, the cameras rolling, the microphones capturing every creak, every groan, every breath of wind that whispered through the broken windows. The front door opened with ease, its hinges protesting but not resisting. They moved slowly through the house, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hollow, empty spaces. The house had been silent for so long, but it felt different now, like it had awakened with their presence, like it was watching them. Upstairs, the rooms were bare, save for the remnants of forgotten memories, the torn wallpaper, the stained carpets, the odd bits of broken furniture scattered like the ghosts of families, past. The team moved methodically, pointing their cameras at everything, cataloguing the decay. They laughed nervously, commenting on the creepy ambience, but their laughter didn't reach their eyes. They were already beginning to feel it, the weight of the place pressing in around them. As they made their way toward the basement, the temperature dropped drastically. Their breath was visible in the air, puffing out in thick clouds. It wasn't a typical winter chill. It was something more, a cold that seemed to come from within the house itself, a cold that gnawed at their skin, at their bones. The camera flickered, the light dimming before returning to full strength. The basement door was cracked open, just slightly, as if inviting them in. None of them said it, but all of them felt the same pull. The unmistakable compulsion to descend into the dark, to discover the truth buried deep beneath the house. One of the crew members, a young woman named Sarah, stepped forward. Her heart raced, her fingers trembling as she reached for the doorknob. It felt cold, like ice, and she shuddered as she turned it. The door creaked open. The basement was as they had expected. Dim, damp, and eerily silent. Their lights illuminated the shadows that stretched across the floor, pooling in the corners. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized something was wrong. The space was far larger than it should have been. There were no natural lights, no windows, no escape. The air was thick with the stench of rot, the same smell that had filled the basement when Kathy Lutz had first opened the door years before. And then the whispers began. They started low, faint, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder with each passing second. Faint at first, like the wind, but soon distinguishable. A voice, then another, then many more, all overlapping, all speaking at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words were barely a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a blade, reverberating in the hollow space. They weren't human. They weren't voices. They were presences, speaking from beyond the veil of reality. The crew stopped, their breath caught in their throats. They looked at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. This wasn't part of the plan. They hadn't come expecting this. They had expected dust, cobwebs, maybe a few odd sounds. But this was different. The temperature dropped again, and Sarah could feel it. Something moving in the shadows, something large, something alive. Come closer. The voice was soft, inviting, seductive. But there was no mistaking its intent. It wasn't asking, it was commanding. One of the crew members, Jason, turned to the others, his voice shaky. We need to leave, right now. But before anyone could react, the basement light flickered violently and went out. The shadows surged. A scream echoed through the house, a scream that wasn't just one voice, but many. Twisted, anguished, hungry. Sarah's camera flickered back to life for a split second, just enough to catch something. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of their lights. Its eyes were glowing, and it wasn't alone. Upstairs, the house seemed to breathe. The shadows in the hallway twisted, reaching down the stairs, stretching out toward the basement where the final confrontation was taking place. The floorboards groaned, and for a fleeting moment, the house stood completely still. And then, with a sharp snap, the lights above them flickered again. The silence was broken by another sound, a low, rumbling growl that echoed from below, vibrating through the walls. The walls, like the rest of the house, seemed to be alive, pulling toward the basement, pulling everything back into its depths. The house was awake again. The crew was never heard from again. Their equipment was found, scattered across the basement, but their bodies, themselves, were never recovered. The whispers never ceased, and the house waited. It always waits. Some houses don't want to be forgotten, and some houses never let you leave. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had become a ghost itself. Its stories whispered through the walls. Its name murmured between those brave or foolish enough to ask about it. The neighborhood had changed. Time had passed, and yet the house remained. It sat there, its windows dark and vacant, its doors sealed, as though it had no need for inhabitants. It no longer needed to kill. It had already taken everything that mattered. But like any creature of darkness, it craved more. It always craved more. Years passed after the documentary crew vanished. Their disappearance, like the others, became another part of the lore, another chilling tale that added weight to the house's already terrifying history. People still spoke of it, of course, but fewer dared approach it. The whispers grew fainter, the curiosity less frequent. But those who lived near 112 Ocean Avenue, those who lived in its shadow, knew the truth. The house didn't just feed on the fear of those who entered. It fed on the silence that followed. The unanswered questions, the stories left untold, the truths hidden behind the sealed windows. It was one evening, when the sun had just dipped below the horizon and a crisp chill filled the air, that a car pulled up on Ocean Avenue. A woman stepped out, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her breath fogging in the cold night. She was a journalist, young and eager, her eyes sharp, her heart fearless. Her name was Ellie, and she had heard the stories. All of them. The DeFeo murders, the Lutz family, the documentary team, and countless others. She'd read the books, watched the films. She knew the history of the house. But what she didn't know was why the house had never truly been abandoned, why no one could leave it alone, why it lingered in the town's collective memory, even when everyone tried to forget it. Ellie had come to find out the truth. Her steps echoed on the gravel as she walked up the long, winding driveway. The house stood there before her like an old, weathered monument. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the front door hung crooked as if it had given up. But the house was still standing, still watching in its own way. She paused at the front door and looked inside. her breath catching as the darkness seemed to stare back at her. For a moment she hesitated. The house felt alive. It felt like it was breathing, like it was waiting. She shook her head and pressed on, pushing the door open, the sound of it creaking against the silence like a whispered warning. Inside it was cold. Cold and quiet. Too quiet. The air was thick, filled with dust, the scent of mold and decay clinging to every corner. The walls were marked with stains, old faded remnants of something that had long since been absorbed into the house itself. The creaking of the house, the sounds of its groans, filled the space. But it was the silence between those sounds, the thickening of the air, that unsettled her. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the stairs that led to the second floor. The shadows up there seemed to reach for her, pulling her into the dark like the hands of forgotten souls. Her heartbeat quickened, but she pressed forward, determined to uncover what had happened, what still was happening in this place. She moved from room to room, photographing the walls, the broken furniture, the peeling wallpaper, but it was the basement door, just slightly ajar, that called to her. The same door that had been opened by the Lutz family, the same door that had invited every curious soul to meet its fate. She hesitated. For a moment she thought of turning back, but she had come too far. She had to know. She stepped toward the basement door. The air in the basement was heavier than it had been upstairs. It was colder too, like the temperature had dropped several degrees as soon as she descended the stairs. Her breath came out in clouds, the cold biting at her skin. And then, there it was. The smell. It was the same suffocating stench of rot, of something ancient and decaying. It filled her lungs, clawing at her, making it difficult to breathe. She fought the instinct to run, to leave. The house had no power over her. She was determined to see this through. The shadows stretched across the floor like living things, creeping toward her feet as she stepped into the basement. The light from her flashlight danced over the walls, revealing patches of black ooze, thick and tar-like, dripping from the cracks, pooling beneath her. And then it happened. A sound, soft at first, almost a whisper, began to emanate from the walls, the unmistakable sound of voices, voices that had no right to be there. Ellie froze. Her heart skipped a beat and her blood turned cold. The voices, they were faint, distant, as though coming from somewhere far deeper than the house. But there was no mistaking them. Ellie! The voices called, low and raspy, as if they had been waiting for her. She stepped back, her breath quickening. It was impossible. It had to be a trick. The house was playing with her mind, she told herself. It had to be. The pressure of it, the air, the smell, the voices, was overwhelming. But there was no denying it. It was real. And they were calling her. She took another step back, then another, her feet shuffling across the cold concrete floor. Her flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. But the shadows weren't moving of their own accord. They were following her, reaching out like claws, dragging her back toward the depths of the house. Come closer, Ellie. The voice was louder now, clearer. It was inside her mind, slithering through her thoughts, filling her head with an unbearable weight. Her body felt heavy, as if it was no longer hers. She felt herself drawn toward the darkness at the far end of the basement. A presence that had waited for years, for someone to step inside, someone to open the door. But Ellie wasn't sure she was going to survive this. The walls of the basement seemed to close in around her, pressing in, suffocating her. Her legs shook as she turned toward the stairs, but the path back to the door felt longer now, as if the house itself had grown larger, its grip tightening with every breath. Come to me, Ellie. The voice was clear now, undeniable. And then something moved in the darkness, something huge, something alive. The air vibrated with its presence, and the temperature plunged to unbearable depths. She spun around, the flashlight's beam flickering as she gasped for breath, her chest tightening. But there was no escaping. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue stood silent once again. Its door left ajar, its windows dark and empty. The whispers continued to echo in the empty spaces, soft and insistent. Another presence had joined the house. Another soul had become a part of it. Another echo to add to the haunting chorus of those who had entered and never left. Some houses never let go. And this house was the keeper of all those lost souls. It was sometime in the deep cold hours before dawn when the Lutz family awoke again. Only they weren't sure if they had ever truly slept. The house had stripped time of meaning. The clocks no longer worked. The air inside 112 Ocean Avenue was timeless, directionless, like a liminal space between life and something else. The walls had begun to shift, not metaphorically, not in dreams or hallucinations, but physically. They breathed. The walls breathed. You could see it if you stared long enough. The wallpaper flexed in and out with a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping lung under cracked plaster. George had seen it first and said nothing. Then Kathy. By the third day of this, whatever this was, the children started drawing it in crayons. Missy drew the breathing walls. Chris drew the dark figure watching from the hallway. Danny stopped drawing altogether. The final 48 hours in that house felt like descending a staircase, where every step was steeper, sharper, more impossible to return from. And once the house knew they were at the end, it wanted them to know. It started with the flies. It was January. The air outside was 20 degrees and falling, snow crusting the windowsills in brittle ridges. But inside, the flies returned. Hundreds, no, thousands, buzzing in heavy black clouds, their fat, oozing bodies slamming against the windows like blind fists. They didn't respond to light or movement. They seemed drawn to something inside the walls. In the sewing room, Kathy found them forming patterns, spirals, endless spirals made of writhing black bodies centered around the cross on the wall. That cross now hung upside down. She had put it there only 2 days earlier. She hadn't hung it upside down, but the house had corrected her. George was no longer sleeping. He wandered the house like a tethered soul, barefoot, pale, muttering to himself about the gateway. He spent more and more time in the basement, in the red room, the small hidden crawl space behind the paneling that hadn't been there when they moved in. It smelled like copper and wet stone. Kathy found him down there one night, crouched low, his hands pressed flat to the concrete floor, whispering, "What are you doing?" He didn't look up. Listening. To what? His eyes flicked to hers. "It's beneath us." And then he smiled. That same sick, crooked smile that didn't belong to him. She left the light on when she backed away. But when she returned later that night, the bulb was shattered and the room was filled with mud. Or what looked like mud. It clung to the walls in thick, veined streaks and reeked of sulfur. That's when she started packing. The next night, the last night, was the worst. It began at 3:15 a.m., always 3:15. The exact time Ronald DeFeo Jr. had stood over his parents' bed and pulled the trigger. The exact time each of the 6 shots echoed through the house, carving a path of death that would never leave, its bones. Kathy awoke to the sheets torn off the bed. George wasn't beside her. From somewhere downstairs she heard the chanting, low, rhythmic. Male voices, layered in Latin, rising and falling like waves on a shore of black sand. She rushed to the children's room. Chris and Danny were huddled in the corner, crying, the air thick with the smell of blood. Missy sat in the middle of the floor, rocking, speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. "He's in the walls now," she said, eyes wide and white. "Jody let him in." "Who, sweetheart?" Missy just smiled. The house shook. Not a creak, not a gust. It shook. The windows rattled in their frames. The light bulbs popped one by one. like glass lungs bursting under pressure. The crucifix on the hallway wall spun violently, dislodged itself, and slammed into the floor. From the vents came the smell again, copper, rot, the musk of something long buried waking up. Then the voices began upstairs. They weren't whispering anymore. They were screaming. "Get out!" Kathy grabbed the children. George appeared at the bottom of the stairs. His face was grey, mouth slack, eyes wild. "We're not leaving," he said. "George, they want us to stay." "No, we want to leave." He didn't answer, just turned and walked back toward the basement door. Kathy didn't follow. She bundled the kids in coats, grabbed keys with shaking hands, and opened the front door. And stopped. Outside, snow fell in thick silence. But the footprints, there were hundreds of them. Bare feet, children's feet, deep and freshly pressed into the snow, all facing the house, none walking away. The cold bit into her skin. She turned. The house behind her was humming. It vibrated through her bones, through her teeth. A low frequency, barely audible, but constant, alive. Then the hallway behind her went black. She felt it before she saw it. The thing, a shadow, massive and slow, crawling down the wall toward her, spilling across the ceiling. It had no face, just eyes, glowing, watching. From the children's room, Missy screamed. Kathy didn't hesitate. She ran. They piled into the van, George still inside, and as the engine turned, something slammed against the side of the vehicle. Hard. The van rocked. Chris cried out. Kathy screamed. The lights flickered on the dashboard and then went out completely. Then, silence. A silence so complete it pressed against their eardrums like water. Snow fell gently on the windshield. The house behind them stood still. They didn't wait for George. They drove. They left everything behind. Furniture, clothes, food on the table. They didn't even return for it. Not once. Not ever. The Lutz family fled 112 Ocean Avenue after 28 days of terror, and they never looked back. But here's what they don't say in the books, in the interviews, in the shows. George Lutz, he wasn't with them in the van. Not at first. He arrived at the rectory 40 minutes later, barefoot, shivering, covered in mud, eyes wide. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, the only thing he said was, "It isn't done with us." The priest they had contacted before the move, the one who had blessed the house, he'd never gone past the stairs. He'd left almost immediately, his hands shaking, his shirt soaked through with sweat. And days later, he suffered blisters on his palms, his car filled with the stench of sewage, and his health deteriorated. He never returned. He never spoke of what he heard in that house, only that someone had told him to leave, and that it had said his name. The house was investigated, photographed, measured, surveyed. Nothing was found. No proof, no evidence, no logical explanation. But those who went inside, they all came out changed. And many, too many, didn't come out at all. The final report, inconclusive. The experts left. The town fell silent. And the house, it waited. The house was quiet again. No more screams, no more flickering lights, no more breathing walls, just silence. But not the silence of peace, the silence of patience. 112. Ocean Avenue remained, unchanged on the outside, untouched by time's erosion. Its once white siding was dulled by age, its windows darkened by dust. The porch sagged, the grass grew wild, but still, it stood, tall, waiting. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, something still moved. It had been nearly 2 decades. The Lutz family never returned. They refused to speak of what happened. Kathy passed in 2004, George in 2006. They took their truth with them. Some say they fabricated it all, a hoax, a cash grab. But others, they know better, because the house never stopped. It was late autumn when someone came back, a man in his 40s, quiet, worn, alone. He didn't give his name. The neighbours only glimpsed him briefly, tall, beard unshaven, eyes hollow. He arrived in a rusted pickup, parked at the edge of the overgrown driveway, and stood in the falling leaves staring at the house for almost an hour before he approached. He unlocked the front door without hesitation. Somehow, he had a key. Inside, everything was dust. The furniture had been stripped long ago, the walls gutted, floors sanded, even the infamous red room boarded up. The staircase had collapsed in on itself, the kitchen torn out to the studs. And yet, the house was whole. The man stepped into the center of the living room, dropped his duffel bag at his feet, and said aloud, "I'm back." His voice didn't echo, it was swallowed. He walked room by room, upstairs first, then the children's rooms. Missy's window still bore faint scratches on the frame, marks where someone had clawed at the wood from inside. The master bedroom smelled faintly of earth. Not mold, not rot, earth, like freshly turned soil. He stood there a long time, staring at the far wall where the crucifix had once hung upside down. Then he descended into the basement. The red room had been sealed with concrete, but the concrete was cracked. The man stepped forward, knelt, and placed his palm against the cold slab. From the other side came a single knock, then another, then silence. He whispered, barely audible, "I know you're still here." And the walls responded. A groan, a shifting of air, a low hum that vibrated through the bones of the house. That night, he slept on the floor of the living room. No lights, no heat, just the sound of wind brushing against the eaves and the soft, steady creaking of the house. But at exactly 3:15 a.m., he sat upright, wide awake. The temperature had dropped to freezing. From upstairs came the soft patter of footsteps, light, small, children's feet, moving from room to room. He didn't move. He just whispered, "You remember me." A voice, low, close, answered from the dark, "We remember everything." The house spoke to him then, not in words, not directly, but in memories, of Missy speaking to Jody at the window, of Kathy levitating above the bed, of George standing shirtless in the snow, chopping wood for hours, eyes blank, of blood oozing from the walls, of the red room breathing, of voices screaming from the air vents, of 6 bullets fired in the dark of November 1974, sealing the fate of every soul that followed. The house had not forgotten, and neither had he. He stayed for 3 nights. No one knows what happened inside. No one saw him leave. But on the 4th morning, the pickup was gone. Only the front door, swinging gently in the wind, remained open. And in the hallway, carved into the wood with something sharp, was a single word. Stay. The house sits empty again, but it's never truly empty. Locals still cross the street to avoid walking past it. Children dare each other to step onto the porch, but none ever do. Real estate agents have stopped listing it. The town tries to forget. But the house doesn't. Because the house is not just wood and nails. The house is a wound. A scar on the skin of something deeper. Something that existed before the land was claimed. Before Amityville was settled. Before the name DeFeo or Lutz ever touched the soil. And it will outlive them all. You might think it's gone quiet. But walk too close. Listen carefully, and you'll hear it breathing.